Okay, welcome to this final recording for Working Lives in Factories and Mills. We're just going to have a brief conversation about some of the issues that have arisen over the last 2 weeks of the course. But first, we wanted to thank you all for your very, very lively and engaging discussions and for interacting with each other as well as with us. And to say that please feel free to leave any more specific questions you might have for us. We'll still be checking the course.
Yes, I'd just like to echo what Kirsty said. I have thoroughly enjoyed the last 2 weeks reading your comments and have been really impressed at the very sophisticated way in which you've handled the material that we've set out for you. The kinds of questions you're asking of that material, I think are exactly right. You've been absolutely wonderful in that respect. And we thought one of the steps that kind of brought that into focus was actually your discussion of Ellen Johnston. And I know, Kirsty, you were kind of as taken as I was by just how kind of thoughtful the responses to Ellen Johnston were.
Yes, and I think it highlighted what a lot of commentators have been doing all the way through, which is thinking hard about the kinds of language used in the materials we're presenting to you and the position that people are writing from, and really questioning what's said in those documents. And Johnson's a particularly interesting case here because her autobiography is so literary and deliberately, as you all noted, representing herself as a literary, a fictional heroine. And the circumstances of her life, they are ambiguous, they are complicated. It's hard to tell when you read up about Ellen Johnson whether she'd be someone you'd have loved or someone you would have hated. She clearly aroused strong feelings in her fellow workers on the factory floor. But she is a fascinating instance of the way in which workers represented their own lives in ways that we might not expect, and in ways that don't always come across to us now as authentic, in inverted commas.
And also, I think a reminder, I know we've had this discussion a couple of times on the course about what counts and doesn't count as an historical document, where a number of you have seen had no problem with the idea that newspapers constitute historical documents, reports of speeches or transcripts from court trials are historical documents, but somehow poems and stories aren't historical documents. And, I think in your response to Ellen Johnston shows the reason why people like Kirsty and myself insist that autobiography, poem, song, short story, novel count as historical documents, because they give us kinds of access to experience that we can't get any other way. And there is also a kind of, it's a two-way process. It's not just that the poetry gives us access, it's also the way in which those literary forms shape the wider culture. So even an apparently factual account might well borrow some of the ways in which it presents its material from literary forms. The rags to riches story, or a story of triumph and tragedy, which is often how newspaper stories are presented, are actually drawing on those literary genre as well.
Yes, we tried to include such a range of sources, firstly to show that you've got to have a range of sources to try to recover any kind of holistic picture of what was going on with workers' lives, because so little remains, and to highlight that so little remains that is unmediated. Even a diary, as in the mill workers' diary that you were all leaving nice comments about, even a diary is mediated. It's thought through, it's read, it's carefully constructed. It's not telling you things that the diarist didn't want their father or their clergyman or their future wife to find out about. So yeah, we're trying to piece together these fragments from sources, all of which are biased, all of which are writing from a particular perspective and trying to sell you a certain idea. And what's been great about the comments is that you are seeing that and you're questioning it.
Absolutely. And another area where, again, we've both been really impressed by the sophistication of the debate is this question of the responsibility of present to past, as it were. We have this information from the past. What sense do we make of it, and how does it inform our sense of the present? So, the number of you that have pointed out that the question of child labour hasn't gone away. It's simply gone somewhere else in terms of global production. Absolutely spot on. A number of you have been raising those kinds of connections, that there's an ongoing debate about how or should we make reparation or restitution for slavery. How far should that extend? Does that extend to the descendants of mill workers who suffered not slave conditions, but pretty grim and gruesome conditions as well? And Kirsty, you wanted, I know, to say something about the kinds of challenges that industrial museums face at the moment in terms of their ability to remember and represent our past.
Well, it was simply to add that you are all highlighting, as Mike says, the relevance of the past and of these materials to present day concerns, and how seeing and reading these materials and thinking about the experiences of 19th century workers can actually make us think in new ways about gender in the workplace, about questions of equal pay, about child labour, and about all these issues. But yet this is a past that is precarious, and it's precarious because industrial heritage museums are so poorly funded. I mean, I was struck reading all your wonderful ideas about how child workers could be represented in the museums, by the question of what's affordable and what isn't for museums, where virtual reality or reenactments or even updating displays that may have been there for 20 years is a huge undertaking, involving access to very limited funding. So it's always important to think about whose heritage is being funded, whose heritage is being supported and preserved. And, you know, we feel ourselves very lucky to have extracted from the government money to make these courses and to do our research into industrial workers and their writing, and, you know, to see that those kind of projects are actually something that in our world has received funding is important, but obviously we hope that that will continue.
Absolutely. And just talking about the kind of project, I mean, a small example, in a couple of the videos that Kirsty recorded, you may have, the more eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed she was standing in front of a couple of banners. Some of those banners were banners that we had made as part of the project, that we then are currently in the business of sending round to different industrial museums. So if, as we hope you will at some point in the not too distant future, you might find yourself at one of our partner institutions, you might just see a Piston Pen and Press banner. And again, it's kind of testament to how much their funding is on a shoestring, that our being able as a project to give half a dozen banners, to lend half a dozen banners, really makes a big difference to those museums, because they just couldn't raise the money themselves to put those banners together at the moment. So, you know, we'll make this plug at the end of the video, but we'll make it now as well. If you get the chance to visit any of our partner institutions, or any industrial museum for that way, as soon as you think it's safe to do so, please do so. And if you're able to put any money in their collecting boxes, please do it. It will be wisely spent, and it will make a big difference to them. The last place we thought we'd go would be, in a sense, just to think about the course overall, and to try and bring together some of the threads that have run through the course, by thinking about how your life might have changed, or how, probably because we need to think generationally here, how your family's experiences might have changed between, say, 1810 and 1890. So, you know, if we start as thinking about a hand loom weaver, which is where the kind of textile industry begins, many of you have kind of picked up on the fact that, well, amongst the advantages of being a hand loom weaver are that your time is more of your own. You can set the pace and rhythm at which you work. There's a little bit of variety in the work that you do. Your family is often part of the production process, so that there's no separation between home and work in that way. And there's often a sense of craft pride at seeing the work that you do, because you produce a piece of cloth almost from beginning to end within the family. So that's kind of where it starts. And I just wonder, that paints a pretty idyllic picture, Kirsty. Do we want to put any kind of caveats in there, any kind of qualifications, say, well, yes, that's all true, but there are also these aspects to being a handloom weaver as well.
Well, I think we've all discovered over the past year that having your work life at home is not always what you want. And I think what we find out from the voices in our project is that, you know, although on this course we see kind of the grimness of factory life, there were kind of advantages, especially to young women, in being able to leave your household. There were advantages in mobility, in being able to move around and take advantage of all the new industrial transport networks and of the links between various industries to try out different kinds of labour, to not be in the village in which you've grown up all your life. Well, for a young person, that's an advantage. We've seen some of the ways in which you could enter a factory at the bottom, especially in the early years of the factory, and particularly for bright young men, actually work your way up. You know, if you're a handloom weaver, there's nowhere for you to go, is there? That's
Yep.
That's your job. It's not necessarily less hard on your body overall either, just in different ways. And the kind of the collectives of the factory, the way in which they enable these cultures of mutual improvement and education, and literary communities and social communities, and of course political communities and trade unionism, which were, you know, it's not that the handloom weavers didn't form these kind of collectives, but it enables it on a much larger and eventually national scale, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of those interesting aspects of the handloom weaver's life is, and it's something Engels comments on, it's quite a restricted life, both geographically and socially. It is the village, in many cases, the village where you were born, with the occasional trip to the market to sell your wares. It's the same kind of cluster of families around you most of the time. There is a much greater sense of mobility that comes with industrialization. So I guess that takes us to the, you know, the powerloom weaver and subsequent generations of the powerloom weaver. The downsides, I think we've noted in a number of the steps we've looked at, the imposition of time discipline and how that was really keenly felt, particularly by the first generation. Whether it's so strongly felt by subsequent generations of factory workers, I think is a more open kind of question. A number of you pointed out that powerloom weaver, in a sense, is subservient to the machine. You know, you serve the machine rather than the machine serving you, and the machine dictates the pace at which you work. The working environment itself is far more unpleasant. It's noisy, it's hot, it's smelly, and it's very, very dangerous in a way that working at home just isn't. But there's also a case in which the element of craft pride survives across the century, even though the work changes. Powerloom weavers think of themselves as skilled workers and do take pride in their ability to run multiple looms, you know, simultaneously. To be a powerloom weaver is to enjoy a degree of status. Anything you've mentioned that the mutual improvement societies, the kind of cultural activities, other kinds of things that are available in towns and cities that aren't available in the village, that perhaps constitute an offset against the grim side of factory life, Kirsty?
Entertainment, all the forms of popular culture, entertainment, musicals, sporting activities, courtship, chance to court people on the factory floor, flirtation, chance to go out with your mates on a Saturday night and parade up and down the town. If you're young people in the finery you bought with your wages from weaving. It fosters different kinds of social culture. Well, that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. I mean, it's difficult because, as someone pointed out, really we need a timeline that highlights all the changes in the Victorian period and how they intersect with life in the factories and mills, because one of the things I think our courses sort of do on the side is they point out how drastic the changes were in the 19th century, and how much, you know, that I think we can all see the pace of change in the 20th and 21st century, but sometimes it's not so obvious that the pace of change was maybe even more rapid, you know, from 1820 to 1920. Everything changed, and Britain's industrialization was a huge part of that.
Yes, I think that's a really important point, isn't it, Kirsty? That if you think about the previous, I don't know, 500-600 years of British industry, very little has actually changed, right? You know, agriculture, there are small improvements here and alterations to the technology you use, but essentially you could take a medieval ploughman from the 10th or 11th century and plonk them down at the end of the 18th century. They'd recognize the horse, they'd recognize the plough, they'd recognize what they're doing. You take a kind of somebody who has grown up in a rural economy and plonk them down in an industrial city, in industrial Manchester, and everything is kind of strange, alien, bewildering in a way that it's difficult for us to get our heads around, because most of us are now used to living in those kinds of conditions, those kinds of cities.
Although people there recognised, you know, the disadvantages and the problems of industry, I think we shouldn't overlook the sense of wonder and pride that people felt at being part of this change, and being, you know, there was an investment in these technologies and these industries, in the firm that you worked for, and the international status of the goods you produced, and the international status of Britain as a producer of those goods, which is very interesting, and which I'm not sure you feel today if you're working in an Amazon warehouse necessarily. So there are shifts in the way you perceive your role as a cog in global industry, though again with the caveat that we, you know, workers tended to, as we've seen, write optimistically about such things rather than negatively. And there is a good book that I can recommend by Emma Griffin, which is very, very interesting, about workers' autobiographies, in which she is making the argument. I've got some questions about this argument, but I think it's a really good and interesting book, that actually workers perceived their work in industry in extremely positive ways, and that our narrative of dark satanic mills has somewhat overlooked this. And that's an intriguing thing to think about.
Yes, I think, you know, Emma's book is very interesting, quite controversial in terms of historical, in terms of historiography. And I also wonder to what extent it might help us to think of the 19th century as a century of two halves. That there's a particular story to be told up to about around 1850, which is actually a story of dispossession, of kind of misery and of grimness. But there is that sense from the 1850s onwards, particularly the 60s and 70s, interrupted admittedly by the cotton famine, of a growing sense of prosperity and a growing sense of optimism on the part of workers. And that's partly because of also the growth of trades unions and the growth of cooperatives. I mean, two things we've touched a little bit on the growth of unions. We really haven't got space on the course to deal with the rise of cooperatives. But if you think about the Rochdale model, I mean, it emerges, it's set up basically by weavers in the textile districts in Lancashire. And by the 1870s, 1880s, the cooperative movement is making sure that as a worker, your family is getting access to good food, good quality food at a good price, often guaranteeing you access to consumer goods at a good price as well, providing kind of insurance schemes, providing other kinds of benefits, co-op libraries, co-op reading rooms, co-op education classes, the co-op women's guild. There's a whole kind of culture of improvement, which isn't, as it were, foisted on the working class from above. It's not like the middle classes and the upper class saying, oh, you must do this, you must do this. It's generated from below by the workers themselves. And I think it plays an important role in creating that sense of progress and optimism, which I think characterizes the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah, no, I agree, definitely. Well, I feel we could talk about the Victorians and how fascinating they are for a long time, Mike. Perhaps we should wrap up.
Yes, we can, and we do, actually, you know.
But yeah, we'll leave by encouraging you again, visit the museums, keep an eye on our project. I keep seeing you all mentioning your great-grandfathers and their reading clubs, and, you know, look under the bed for those boxes of poetry. We are creating a database that highlights industrial workers reading writing practices and societies and organizations that promoted cultural practices and that workers belong to. So it sounds like some of you may have information about that. We'd love to hear about it. Get your relatives represented in our database for Scholars of the Future to find.
Yep, you can find us on Twitter. You can drop us an email, which details you'll find on the website. So if you do come across that information, please do let us have it. I'd like to second what Kirsty said about the importance of visiting those industrial museums. And also, if you get the chance, our kind of cultural artists, our cultural partners, Jennifer Reed, Gillian Frame, Finley Napier, they've also had a tough time during the pandemic, the last 18 months as well. If you get a chance to support them in any way, shape or form, even if it's only following them on Twitter and saying how much you've enjoyed their performances on this course, that would be very much appreciated as well. Finally, we've really enjoyed reading your comments. I've really enjoyed running this course. I'd like to thank you for, for giving me 4 really interesting weeks, plenty of things to think about. I hope you've enjoyed the course too. And for my part, I'd just say, stay safe and best wishes.
Indeed. Stay safe, all of you. Thanks so much for participating, and maybe we'll see you again on our future courses or in our events. Thank you.
Bye-bye.